Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Zainab Jamal, and we at CCMW are very excited to have all of you join us for a presentation with Dr. Munasale. Before we begin, we'll start with the recitation of Quran, followed by a line acknowledgement. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. I begin by acknowledging that Allah created humanity in and of this earth as her Khalifa, and this land that we're on has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. We can never work to end systematic and institutional violence if we do not center the narratives of indigenous folks in our collective decision-making for social justice and equity. As settlers in Turtle Island, we directly benefit from decolonization and genocide of the indigenous people of this land. In order to engage in resistance and solidarity against the injustices inflicted on the indigenous people of this land, it is imperative we constantly engage in acts of decolonization. Therefore, I would like to acknowledge that this land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Piton First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was a subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and Allied Nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to any who may be here with us today, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Miigwech. Now I'll pass the mic to Umaima to go over the housekeeping rules for tonight.
Salam, everyone. Before we get started, I'll just be going over some of our housekeeping rules briefly. Please be mindful of being respectful. We also invite your comments and questions, and we will be running a live Q&A session at the end of the seminar, and we'll mainly be using the chat box for that. Please also feel free to contribute to the Q&A session with an open mind and an open heart, and use I statements. Please also consider that the Q&A session is a dialogue, not a debate. So please keep that in mind and actively engage in listening. Also, we will have a post-event survey that will be emailed to you later today, and it will only take about 5 minutes to complete. So we ask that you please take the time to complete that for us. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome. One second. I want to welcome all of you to another session of CCMW's Women Scholar Series. For the past 40 years, the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, or CCMW, has been on an important mission to affirm Canadian Muslim women's identities and to promote an understanding of our lived experiences through community engagement, through research, through influencing public policy, and through striving for positive change. One of CCMW's strategic goals is to promote critical thinking among Muslims and non-Muslims, to challenge stereotypes and assumptions about Islam, Muslim women, and their families. This webinar is part of a series of public seminars focusing on the work of contemporary Muslim women scholars that are based on different topics related to Muslim women. We look forward to continuing to present these seminars, inshallah. I will now pass the baton on to Nushat Jaffrey, CCMW's Executive Director. Thank you, Nushat.
Thank you, Nina. I really do feel like it's a baton, we've been passing to one another. So thank you. And we're so delighted that you've joined us, all of you've joined us for this really interesting seminar. I'm just trying to learn more about the work that Munasale has done. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Munasale. She is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at Concordia University of Edmonton. She's a former elementary and secondary school teacher, mother to 3 awesome humans, and the author of Stories We Live and Grow Up By. retelling our experiences as Muslim mothers and daughters. Drawing upon her experiences as an intergenerational survivor of violent Palestinian displacement and as a caregiver to a child with a disability, her most recent research is a narrative inquiry alongside Muslim mothers of children with disabilities who arrived in Canada with refugee experiences. Over to you, Muna.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for that, Ms. Het, and thank you, Nina, and all of the people who have helped to make tonight possible. I will be sharing my screen right away. Please just bear with me as I get it ready. And yeah, so thank you again. And I'm going to not take much more time. I'm going to get going with my presentation. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. So before I begin my presentation, I want to honor and acknowledge that I'm currently in Treaty 6 territory, a home place for many Indigenous nations and communities, including Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux peoples. As a daughter and granddaughter of Palestinian refugees, I intimately know the intergenerational reverberations of colonial violence and injustice in my family. And I'm committed to my responsibilities as a treaty person and as an educator for justice, inshallah. So before I really delve into the presentation and start to share what I've learned over these many years, I want to ask you to please reflect on what you think when you hear the word citizenship. I know that maybe the title of this presentation might have thrown some people off, and I understand that it's not typical to say dis and then you see the backslash citizenship. I'm going to really try to unpack and make clear why I've conceived of such a term and such an idea as dis citizenship in relation to some of what I'm going to be discussing, because I'm not the first person, as you will see, to think of it some of these things in these ways. So just on your own, maybe jot some things down or just, kind of bookmark it in your mind for later. When you think of the word citizenship, what does that actually entail? How does somebody know they're a full citizen? And we'll come back to that. So just a few moments to really think of that. So this presentation does draw on my almost 2-year narrative inquiry alongside Fatima, a Syrian Muslim woman who arrived in Canada, and specifically Treaty 6 lands, as a refugee in 2017. I sought to inquire alongside Fatima into her pre- and post-migration experiences as a mother and as a caregiver to disabled children. And so when I say that I narratively inquired alongside Fatima first, just to make this clear, is of pseudonym. But narrative inquiry is a research methodology that is grounded in the view that life is profoundly storied, that we live in stories, we live by stories, and we live with stories in different ways. And so because this research is rooted in storied experiences, from only a few participants, I did inquire alongside Fatima, but there was also Warda, who I won't be sharing much of Warda's stories today, although they do resonate quite a bit with Fatima's. I really wanted to delve into what was some of Fatima's experiences, because I viewed them as being very profoundly illustrative of how this citizenship can be experienced in different ways. And so, although, there are a few participants, so I can't really provide quote unquote answers to problems here. What I can do is share some of these stories with you, really unpack how I understood them alongside Fatima, and really draw on some insights that it can help to give us into how do we live in different ways. Because ultimately that's the hope, is that these stories, it's not just to share stories, where I'm not just sharing stories. It's how can these stories help us to understand our world, and how can they give us insights into how we can live in better ways alongside each other, inshallah. And so I really wanted to begin by sharing a story alongside Fatima pretty early on in our research. And I will be talking about the actual details of the research, but I really wanted to begin with a story. So ما فيهم ياخدوها مننا صح? Fatima's question continues to weigh heavily on my heart and mind. They can't take her away from us, right? I remember when Fatima asked me a variation of this question during our very first research conversation in the early fall of 2019. Fatima was 8 months pregnant and had been up most of the night to use the washroom and to make sure, as I'm sure many people who've experienced pregnancy will understand and relate with, and to make sure that her eldest daughter, Iman, was comfortable. I planned for our very first research conversation to be relatively short so we can get to know each other slowly. However, every time I tried to ease into ending the conversation, Fatima would ask more questions. I recall getting a strong sense that Fatima might not have had many opportunities to ask questions in Arabic about citizenship, schools, policies, and other social codes and structures. I also remember feeling admiration for her strength and forthrightness in the midst of challenges I can only ever imagine navigating. I remember feeling enveloped by the warmth that radiated from her and throughout the home she made alongside her husband Mahmoud and their children Ali, Iman, and Maryam. During that first research conversation though, Fatima shared how in the midst of bombings and gunfire, she and her family escaped her small village in Syria in December 2011. She said they were originally grateful to be in a refugee camp in neighboring Jordan until they realized that they didn't have access to schooling for their children or medical or therapeutic supports for Iman, who has cerebral palsy, and Maryam, who was hard of hearing. Fatima shared her elation when in December 2016, she and Mahmoud were contacted by resettlement officials and informed that they were selected for resettlement in Canada. She expressed her anxiety and excitement as she boarded an airplane for the first time and laughingly recounted her surprise at how warm it was when they arrived in the summer of 2017 because she assumed that Canada was always chilly. Fatima stressed that while they're grateful for escaping what she characterized as the despair of the refugee camp, they've been confronted with many different types of challenges since their arrival in Canada. She mused, quote, "We were happy before the war, but the good thing is that we have each other, alhamdulillah." Over the multiple conversations that Fatima and I engaged in, Mahmoud, Ali, Iman, Maryam, and later, baby Hannah, and these are all pseudonyms, of course, often joined us for brief periods. In February 2020, during our last in-person conversation before COVID-19 lockdowns in March, Mahmoud entered the living room and asked if I could translate a letter that Maryam's school had sent in English. Both Fatima and Mahmoud had previously expressed their desire to be able to communicate with their children's teachers and school administrators without the need for translators, who are not always reliable or available, or their eldest son, Ali, who translates as best he can, but he was also still learning the English language. And that's a pretty adult role for a child, even if the child is 15 years old. After I translate the letter, Fatima and Mahmoud shared a troubling experience with Maryam's school. They discussed how during a meeting the month before with Maryam's teacher, school administrators, and occupational therapists, they were told, according to the translator, that they were in violation of Maryam's human rights by not ensuring she wears her hearing aids at all times. Fatima said that she tried telling Maryam's teacher multiple times that Maryam complains of severe discomfort and pain from her hearing aids, so she cannot force her to wear them, but, quote unquote, they don't listen to me. After she and Mahmoud shared their outrage at being judged and storied as bad parents, Fatima asked why, rather than making them feel threatened, Maryam wasn't supported with better hearing aids or even surgery to help her. She asked, why are they talking about human rights? We did the impossible for our children. Fatima paused before asking, but they can't take her away from us, right? Because of the story she had previously shared with me, I recognize that this question was shaped by Fatima's knowings of governments that can and do commit violence against their own citizens. Over time, I also began to understand that Fatima was hearing stories from other Syrian mothers who arrived in Canada of the need to be careful during interaction with school officials and service providers, because they could recommend that, quote, the government take your children away if they think you are not raising them right, end quote. So as the storied reflection I just read gives a sense of, narrative inquiry involves the researchers situating themselves in the research that they're very much part of, because it is my understandings of what was shared that are shaping how I write about them and how I present that to others. So it definitely is shaped by my experiences as a Palestinian Muslim woman, mother, scholar, educator, and granddaughter of Palestinian refugees making a life in Treaty 6 lands. In my past doctoral research alongside other Canadian Muslim mothers and daughters, I noted that participants and I carry the privilege of familiarity with not only the English language, but also the social and educational systems and norms in these local and national contexts, even as we regularly contended with discrimination. However, in my often contentious parental advocacy for my autistic 9-year-old daughter in schools and community places, I have often wondered about the experiences of Muslim refugee mothers and their disabled children who are unfamiliar with the language and systems and norms of a new land, while also contending with the grief and trauma of violent displacement. So at the beginning of every semester in my teacher education classes, I assert that many children, youth, and their families and caregivers, particularly those who live in poverty, are newcomers, disabled, Indigenous, Black, Brown, LGBTQ2S+, and are marginalized based on any other aspects of their identities, often do not experience schools and education systems as places of safety, belonging, and/or quote-unquote inclusion. I assert that many students, caregivers, and families, and even educators in these landscapes regularly experience different forms of dis-citizenship. Several pre-service teachers shift uncomfortably in their seats at my assertions. Indeed, when I share my research and plethora of experiences with racism, discrimination, and exclusion as a Palestinian Muslim woman in hijab and mother and caregiver to an autistic child, I can sense resistance, even disbelief, from some in class. Inevitably, at least one pre-service teacher refers to the aspirational aims of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or CCRF, at some point during our discussions. This is what I've come to understand as the bad apple argument. And so as you see the bad apple, clip art, if you were wondering why is it there, the argument that while individuals within various systems can be racist, ableist, and/or otherwise discriminatory, the system cannot be, as it is built on a foundation of quote-unquote rights and freedoms. Even when I remind pre-service teachers that systems are comprised of and propped up by individuals, many seem to have a difficult time reconciling their stories of Canada and Canadian schools as quote-unquote multicultural, diverse, and/or inclusive, with the testimonies of marginalized children, youth, and families and their caregivers. Unsurprisingly, those who are racialized and/or disabled, or care for someone who's racialized and/or disabled, and maybe marginalized in other ways, don't seem to experience discomfort with my assertions in similar ways. I think that this is because they've often lived and/or witnessed stories of dis-citizenship too. So for historical and socio-political context, the CCRF was passed in 1982. 3 years later, it was amended to entrench specific rights for Canadian citizens with disabilities. Section 15 of the CCRF states, every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination, and in particular, without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. 25 years later, on March 10, 2010, Canada ratified the United Nations 2006 Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, otherwise known as CRPD, and then ratified the optional Protocol of the CRPD on December 8, 2018, this is actually meant to strengthen the implementation of the convention. So basically 18 years after it was adopted by the United Nations, Canada signed the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees on June 4, 1969. And then on December 10, 2018, it's also signed the UN Migration Compact for safe, orderly, quote unquote, safe, orderly, and regular migration, which is, quote unquote, the first global framework on all aspects of international migration. And then more recently, in 2007, Canada accepted 26,000 of 68.5 million newly displaced peoples worldwide, 52% of whom are children. The Canadian government then committed to accepting 43,000 refugees in 2018, 45,650 in 2019, and 48,700 in 2020. However, as of October 31st, 2020, Canada has accepted a total, it's a fraction of what is about a third of what they had pledged to accept, which is 44,620 Syrian refugees. So these and other legislative practices, agreements, and just pieces of legislation generally bolster the image, the story of Canada as a welcoming and inclusive nation. However, as we have seen time and again in recent media, posts and articles, when the recent uncovering, as we know, of Indigenous children, the graves of Indigenous children, unmarked graves. There's a history of very dark practices in this nation state, a settler colonial nation state. There needs to be much to be done. There's a long way to go for Canada to be truly considered inclusive, quote unquote, particularly for newcomers with disabilities. So Section 38(1)(c) of Canada's Immigration and Refugee Protection Act outlines criteria for refusal of immigrant applicants' admission to Canada deemed to be, quote unquote, an excessive demand on the nation state's health and social services. So it's frequently resulted in the refusal of immigrant and refugee applicants with disabilities to Canada. So how can you reconcile Section 15 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms with the current practice? And it has changed somewhat since then. It's not so entrenched in terms of the excessive demand clause. I think that since I spoke with Fatima, it's been revisited, formally rescinded. However, as we know, in the absence of something that has been a practice for decades, does not necessarily mean that it's no longer a practice. Just as, something being written into law does not necessarily mean that that is followed. So another thing that I really want everybody to also be aware of is that disabled people and caregivers and families who are accepted, so refugee, immigrant, and claimant newcomers, experience myriad barriers to obtaining legal Canadian citizenship after they arrive on these colonized lands, now known as Canada. For example, to even qualify to write the test for Canadian citizenship, a Canadian language benchmark, so CLB, level 4 or higher in speaking and listening in English or French is required. So as I said, many pre-service teachers, the pre-service teachers that I currently engage with and I teach within my post-secondary context, particularly those who have in the past or continue to believe the self-congratulatory declarations of quote-unquote inclusive Canadian classrooms, schools, and society, are shocked when they learn of this history and context. Not to mention so many of the what is known as the dark history that Canada has suppressed for very long, including our education systems. Although much has been written and discussed within education, research, and literature in relation to any combination of the terms diversity, equity, inclusion, there are many ongoing barriers to accessibility, opportunity, and agency that continues to characterize formal schooling, including for disabled children and their families and caregivers. In many school systems, inclusion is still too often approached as physically including the bodies of disabled children and youth in classrooms and school spaces, while simultaneously excluding them through the quote-unquote continuation of traditional practices of segregation and integration of students into an unchanged school system. This is by Gillum and Williamson. And this is actually one of the major criticisms of the inclusive model, is that you have a pre-existing structure that you've made it so that, oh, we, the majority, are okay with having you physically present. But what does it mean to be physically present when the structure has not changed? And it is more of almost like a benevolent, okay, fine, you can come in. Rather than by having people who are different, including disabled children, youth, and so forth, the structure will necessarily need to change to make it more equitable and a place where everyone can thrive. And when I say thrive, that is why I brought in, we need to do more than survive. Abolitionist teaching in the pursuit of educational freedom, by Bettina Love, she talks about mattering, that children in classrooms, children, youth in classrooms, people in society generally need to matter. And this idea of what does it mean to profoundly matter, drawing Du Bois's concept of we who are dark, quote unquote, to signify anti-Black racism that undergirds all oppressive systems, Bettina Love offers the following, quote unquote, we who are dark want to matter and live, not just to survive, but to thrive. Matter not for recognition or acknowledgement, but to create new systems and structures for educational, political, economic, and community freedom. It would mean we matter enough that our citizenship and the rights that come with it are never questioned, reduced, or taken away, regardless of our birthplace or the amount of melanin in our skin. Mattering, citizenship, community sovereignty, and humanity go hand in hand with the ideas of democracy, liberty, and justice for all, which are the unalienable right to thrive. And so a lot of people would question, I don't know if it actually makes sense to some people, well, why are you talking about mattering but you're talking to people outside of school landscapes? I really wanted to also talk about this concept of curriculum making, because it doesn't make sense otherwise, because I am an education professor. So if I'm talking to women outside of school landscape, how does that actually work? And the idea is that curriculum is not a program of studies. It is not the formal binder teachers are given to implement. Curriculum, if we're going to understand it in the broad sense that I think we need to understand it, is that it's what are children learning? What are they being taught? And that this learning happens in multiple places, not just in school places. If anything, children probably learn more about who they are and about whether or not they actually matter. Yes, of course, in schools, but across all community places and in their own homes. So that is why what I wanted to know is what's the curriculum that is being composed within, disabled Muslim children who are newcomers, who are coming in with refugee experiences. And again, I don't like to say refugee children or refugee mothers, because it's not their identity. It's the experience that they might have had. And it might have been how they were able to, be newcomers here, because again, if you have a disabled family member, you're less likely to be able to enter into Canada. And so I really wanted to clarify. That's why I chose to research alongside mothers. And it is a part of the children's curriculum. And so I really wanted to also talk about what is my conception of citizenship. And I really think that we have to think about who matters in school communities specifically, who doesn't. What about larger society, and why? And I'm really drawing on Frederick and Schiffer's notion that good citizenship, quote unquote, ideals of good citizenship, including independence, rugged individualism, and moral and intellectual competence, were delineated through the othering of bad citizens, those who were defined as dependent, incompetent, and morally depraved. Thus, notions of deviance, disability, and normalcy have been and continue to be imbued into citizenship laws, practices, and cultural values. And so when I talk about dis-citizenship with that backslash, I'm really drawing on the work of Goodley and Runswick Cole, who really troubled the neoliberal. And when I say neoliberal, it's this individualistic notion of the capacity to work towards capital. So basically, are you able to make money? Are you able to work? That's an underpinning of current conceptions of citizenship. So Goodley and Runswick Cole argued for a transformative dis-citizenship, and with that backslash, via disability studies, with the backslash again. So one that acknowledges and reckons with the quote unquote theoretical, practical, and political work that takes place on either side of the binary, a binary denoted by the presence of that backslash. Basically, this idea that this citizenship means there are places where we are not deemed as full citizens for whatever reason. We don't feel that we are full citizens for whatever reason as well. And there are places where we are. So it depends on context too. And it depends on power imbalances. And so Goodley and Runswick Cole really invite us to consider how we value the human and what kinds of society what kind of societies are we as worth fighting for. And I really wanted to also highlight how this is not, coming from also an ableist perspective, because honestly, the only reason why this has been, understood in this way is because of self-advocates from within disabled communities that have been sounding that alarm for generations. So I'm not going to take too much longer, but I did want to delve into that initial story I shared about some of my experiences with Fatima. And so thinking about Fatima and the stories that she shared with me, I do want to share a little bit more of my process. So in August 2019, 2 women responded to my research call for participants who are Muslim refugee mothers of disabled children. Fatima and Warda both arrived in Canada in 2017 as government-assisted refugees. And I make it clear that they're government-assisted refugees because there was a great deal of private sponsorship as well. And they were both arrived in Canada following long periods of displacement from Syria in different refugee camps. And they're each mothering 2 disabled daughters. So between September 2019 and July 2020, I engaged in multiple one-on-one research, in-person and virtual conversations in the Arabic language alongside each participant within familial curriculum making landscapes. And again, the familial curriculum making is, again, what is being taught and learned within home and community landscapes. We inquired together into the following. What are the stories that shape you, your life, and the curriculum making alongside your families and disabled children? What are the stories that root and sustain you in your mothering? What stories are tension-filled as you compose curriculum and lives alongside children, families, and others in Canada? And so in this presentation, I only delve into Fatima's stories, as I made clear earlier. So Fatima and her husband, Mahmoud, are parents and caregivers to 4 children. Fatima was close to 8 months pregnant with her fourth and youngest child when we first started engaging in research conversations. The eldest Ali is now 16, close to 17 years old. Iman is now 14 years old and lives with cerebral palsy. And Maryam is now 12 years old and is hard of hearing. The youngest, Hanan, is now a little over 2 years old. They escaped from Syria in late 2011 and lived in a refugee camp in Jordan until they were able to come to Canada as government-sponsored refugees in the summer of 2017. So as I share some of these narrative threads that emerge from that story and from transcripts and field texts that reverberated across Fatima's storytelling, it's important to note, again, that all of my conversations with Fatima were in Arabic and that these are my translated words. So the research literature is awash with assertions that the mental health of refugee mothers is a huge concern after resettlement because of many barriers and factors, including lack of proficiency in the English language, potentially, lack of financial, familial, and community supports, oftentimes, potential ongoing trauma and general feelings of isolation. So this was actually underscored in my research alongside Fatima. So in Canada, newcomers have different expectations and processes for obtaining legal citizenship. And so when I say legal citizenship, I'm differentiating from the sense of belonging and mattering. So their legal citizenship status is dependent on many factors, and whether they are landed immigrants, so basically many immigrants are accepted because of quote unquote the point system, or because of family reunification processes, or they're refugee claimants. And there are other ways of also obtaining entry in citizenship. For those who arrived as government recognized refugees, there's a relatively new expectation that they'll take something known as LINK, Language Instruction for Newcomers to Canada, classes and pass level 4 requirements. This course is provided to newcomers by the federal government, but as Fatima made clear over many of our conversations, this requirement was a huge barrier for her and a source of ongoing anxiety and exhaustion. So during our very first research conversation, Fatima really discussed how she was exhausted. And I asked her, why aren't you sleeping? She said, oh, I'm getting up at night because, she was pregnant, but also she was checking in quite often on Iman, her daughter who has cerebral palsy. And so she talked about how it was almost impossible to go to her LINK classes most days because she just can't, get there in the morning. She hadn't slept all night. And so just, even with that little bit of context where Fatima says, I want to go to my LINK classes, but the problem is I'm tired. There's the other factor is that Fatima grew up in a rural area in Syria. When I was first researching for this research project alongside, the refugee mothers, I really delved into, okay, what are some of the contexts in Syria? And it's, officially there, in the past, there was a 97% literacy rate. Fatima never went to school, however, because she was in a rural area, and she made it clear that her family, they thought that they taught her, and she thought she learned all she needed to learn to live a good life in a very rural farming community in Syria. But so she talked about how, quote unquote, the government, they bring in people and then they impose conditions on them that it's almost impossible for them to fulfill. And she said, education isn't everything. It's not up to me or my parents, the fact that I didn't go to school. Because also, even if they did feel like, okay, you know what, she's going to need this for the future, there wasn't a school nearby that was accessible to them. Another thing that I really wanted to focus on is how she said that they don't listen to me. And when she said it in this context, she meant education and service providers meaning disability services. And so the literature on, teaching and teacher education for and with students with refugee experiences stresses the importance of building mutually respectful and supportive relationships with students and their families or caregivers. So this is also true for the research literature related to the experiences of families and caregivers for disabled children. So like I said before, as a mother to a 9-year-old autistic daughter, I have long resonated with the research that made it clear that parental advocacy is incredibly important. Sadly, these systems, they're not made to be accessible. That's where the advocacy is so important. So even as that can be frustrating with institutions and systems that too often medicalize our children's lives, they are inherently ableist. Sadly, I've too often felt unheard and dismissed myself. Even though I have, alhamdulillah, experienced such, I've had great experiences with Maya's individual teachers, the system is not designed for her. And so this was also Fatima's sense much of the time in relation to service providers and school liaisons and translators. I can't express how often Fatima responded with, I don't know, or quote unquote, they won't listen to me, as I tried to better understand the reasoning for some of the decisions being made for her daughters and for their family. So for example, during our third research conversation, shortly after Fatima gave birth to Hanan, I asked Fatima if her family's caseworker with Alberta's Children Disability Services, known as FSCD, has been in contact with them and if she's been receiving support. She responded that she barely hears from them. She said that in her first year of resettlement, she felt there was a lot more support, especially with English language translation. She worries because her husband, who's at a level 2 of beginner English, at least at the time we were still in conversation for research conversations, her husband is often the person who needs to be trying to speak with different doctors and service providers because an Arabic language translator is not always available. She was also concerned with the fact that her eldest son, Ali, would also try. Again, at the time, he was, I think, 13 years old, not 15. So this barrier was a source of constant anxiety that was heart-achingly made visible to me when during our very first research conversation, Fatima asked me if it would be okay if she called me if she wanted to labor in the middle of the night. She was worried that she wouldn't be able to make her wishes known if she needed to medical staff. Fatima felt profoundly unheard, however, even when translators were available, because she often didn't know them and thought they were maybe wasn't sure if they were translating with fidelity, because she said that her messages never seemed to get across. She wasn't sure if people weren't listening to her, if the messages weren't getting to them. She repeatedly asserted that she did everything she could for her children, even advocating for them to be taught to read and write by an older child in the refugee camp when they were still in the refugee camp, and making sure to get a wheelchair for Maryam on the day she found it painful to walk. And I personally also experienced her advocating for Maryam to get a bigger wheelchair because the one that they were using for her wasn't good enough. I'm sorry, I'm saying Maryam and it was Iman. I apologize. That's an eldest daughter with cerebral palsy. And so the last thing I really wanted to delve into is this idea that they can't take her away from us. And that was at the very beginning of the story that I shared with you earlier. And so this really gives a sense of Fatima's profound worry and concern that her lack of citizenship and ability to advocate for herself and her daughters in the English language could result in having her daughters, especially the two middle daughters who are disabled, removed from her care. And to my confusion, Fatima first expressed this worry during our first research conversation. Initially, I was taken aback by her questioning that if they didn't get citizenship, could, quote, unquote, they, the government, keep her children in Canada and send her back? I started to better understand this concern when she explained that she heard rumors about this in her link classes by other refugee mothers who were trying to encourage Fatima to focus and learn English. I also understood that as a refugee from Syria, Fatima's knowing was that governments can and often do exert this kind of power and violence. And here in the settler colonial context of Canada, we also know that the government, the nation state, has used children as a tool for forced assimilation, and specifically Indigenous children. So this is not beyond the pale. And through the ongoing process of social services and adoption, and through the 60s and 70s and 80s group, like it's ongoing here as well. So this is not beyond unimaginable, beyond imagination. So in our very last in-person conversation in February 2020, Fatima and her husband Mahmoud both expressed this worry even more urgently as they shared their experiences with recent team meeting at Iman's school. And remember, Iman is her daughter who's hard of hearing. She doesn't currently qualify for surgery to have cochlear implants. She's expected to wear hearing aids at all times. However, Fatima asserts that Iman hates her hearing aids and they cause her immense pain and discomfort, so she doesn't force her to wear them at home. Fatima and Mahmoud were called to the school for a meeting alongside Iman's teacher, EA, and specialists. They were provided with a translator from a local resettlement agency before that meeting. I was trying to follow what Fatima and Mahmoud were trying to explain to me about the meeting as best I could, but they were often talking quickly and over each other with frustration as they shared that they were called, quote unquote, bad parents for not making Iman wear her hearing aids. They were told by the translator that the school team said they were violating Iman's human rights. This angered both Fatima and Mahmoud as it asserted that she was in pain and should be supported with either surgery or a better device. They felt that the translator wasn't translating their words with fidelity because why weren't they being understood? Why were they not being heard? And they stress, quote unquote, why are they talking about human rights? We are good parents. We did everything for our children. So to wrap up, sorry, 1 second. This presentation included some of Fatima's stories to illuminate 2 interconnected narrative threads of our narrative inquiry. 1, the many ways that Fatima drew upon her embodied knowledge to sustain herself, her disabled children, and her family. Number 2, even as she contended with ongoing discrimination and trauma and re-traumatization, including in relation to school curriculum making worlds. Fatima's stories, including many that I didn't share, revealed how she rooted her familial curriculum making with love, faith, and intergenerational stories of care, even as she navigated to citizenship through the intersections, I'm using it as Kimberly Crenshaw uses systems and the intersection of these systems and how they're experienced differently by different people, through the intersections of ableism, silencing, being silenced, lack of linguistic, financial, and mental health supports, Islamophobia, racism, xenophobia, ableism, sexism, and a host of linguistic and other systemic and institutional barriers to accessibility and opportunity. Retelling one of her post-migration stories of being made to feel inadequate by one of her daughter's teachers, Fatima shared that she was made to feel like a barghash, which basically means insect, because of her positionality, because of who she is. And she stated, quote unquote, you know how it is for a refugee. They don't see us as human. And that's where the title for this presentation came from. Those are the words, the very words she used. They don't see us as human. But the good thing is we have each other, alhamdulillah. I was and still am amazed at how often I heard Fatima still express gratitude for being with her family and for their overall health and well-being, even as she shared many of the stories that I could barely withhold tears as I bared witness to. But it is important to stress that not all of Fatima's stories involve navigating discrimination and trauma. She lived a curriculum of love and care and, joy at times, of course, in her home. And so that's where the tension comes from, because when I focus on these kinds of stories, you don't get a sense of that. But it is important to share these stories so that things can, inshallah, get better. Because many of her stories do really show this wide gulf between the rhetoric of welcoming inclusive schools and society and the actual practices and how these are experienced by specifically and particularly Syrian Muslim refugee students and caregivers and families. And so sadly, much of the research literature on the experiences of Muslim students highlight how many school systems have been complicit in and sometimes explicitly contribute to Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism and sentiment. And so while not all of Fatima's post-migration stories centered around experiences of discitizenship, many of her tellings really underscored Aravel's and Minier's assertion in 2010 that, quote, those who are located perilously at the intersections of race, class, gender, and disabilities are constituted as non-citizens, as nobodies, by the very social institutions, the legal, educational, and rehabilitational systems that are designed to protect, nurture, and empower them. So every time I present this research, someone inevitably asks me some variation of, so what are the lessons from this research? And it's a question that honestly gives me some tension, because I'm fearful of either myself or others reducing Fatima's stories to a list of best practices, as if context doesn't matter. And so almost that can be approached as a checklist to prove, quote unquote, that an institution is inclusive, accepting, and diverse. And if you want to learn more about that idea of the proof of us being accepting, read Sada Ahmed's work, and I can also direct you to some of that work. So rather than attempting to do this, I invite you all to imagine forward alongside me of thinking with Fatima's stories and our retellings, and starting to really get this sense of how might Fatima's stories have been retold had Maryam's school team carefully listened to her rather than judged her for refusing to force by judging Fatima to refuse to force her daughter to wear a device that she found painful. How might her stories have been retold if care had been taken to make her feel like her embodied knowing, and by extension that she matters? How might we think of Fatima's stories and begin to live out different stories within school contexts and beyond? How might we ensure that caregivers like Fatima never feel the need to say the words, quote unquote, you know how it is for a refugee, we are not seen as human, or they don't listen to me, or they can't take her away from us, right? So what to do, basically? I love how Dr. Dwayne Donald, in his 2013 article for the ATA magazine, troubled how this idea that, you know, you have this pre-existing structure and we need to include or infuse Indigenous perspectives. And he said, instead, we need to root our curriculum making with Indigenous knowledges and wisdoms. And so he asserted that, quote unquote, we need a new story to guide us, is what he said, because as Thomas King asserted, quote unquote, the truth about stories is that that's all that we are. So I end with these words by Barry Lopez as a reminder to myself and for us all, inshallah, to engage in ways guided by what my good friend and brilliant scholar, Dr. Donald, conceptualizes as ethical relationality. This idea of walking in a good way, as Dr. Mary Young once wrote about. And so this is from Crow and Weasel by Barry Lopez. And I love this exchange. Remember on this one thing, said Badger. The stories people tell have a way of taking care of them. If stories come to you, care for them and learn to give them away where they are needed. Sometimes a person needs a story more than food to stay alive. That is why we put these stories in each other's memories. This is how people care for themselves. And I would argue, each other. And so, at the beginning of the presentation, I asked you to think about citizenship and how you conceptualize it. And I want you to think about, after you've heard some of these stories that I hope that you will take care of, inshallah, has your conception changed? And you don't have to answer that, but if you feel comfortable, it would be great to see what you think about that in the chat, inshallah. So I will end now. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Muna, for that insightful presentation. I really, really enjoyed that. It was really great to hear your perspective, and I really appreciated how you're able to, give us nuance through your way of storytelling. So thank you so much for that. We're going to move on to a Q&A session. So at the bottom of your Zoom window, you can either input any questions into the chat, or you can hit the Q&A button and put questions there. So please feel free to go ahead, and then I'll read any questions out for Muna. And if anybody from the CCMW team has any questions, please feel free to unmute and go ahead and ask.
Muna, I completely identified with your statements surrounding Fatima's experience with school and Link. My husband volunteers at a refugee clinic in Hamilton, and I'm a volunteer there too in the administrative section. And oftentimes the clients will come to him and say, look I never went to school back home in Syria. I never sat in a classroom in a small chair at a desk. I don't have a strong grasp of my own language as far as, written and stories and, the whole bit. He says, how can I then add another language of English, which has no connection with Arabic? They're really stuck. And as you said, we put these parameters for them to gain citizenship or welcome to the Club of Canada, but it's not working for all of them. We brought them to this country. We made it look on the world stage that we are so benevolent, us Canadians, our leaders, which they were. I mean, we all saw those pictures where Trudeau came to the airport and was zipping winter coats on kids, and tears flowed. But we can't just do that for the cameras. They need our help for years afterwards. We have to hold their hand and create spaces where they can thrive, where they can, show their gifts to us. They are gifts that we have no imagination. We cannot comprehend all their strengths that they can bring to this society and make Canada a better place. Anyway, I really appreciated you, talking about Fatima and her experience with school and learning English.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Because one of the things that really, I think most people who have taught English as a second or additional language understand the concept that once you're very strong in your first language, including in reading and writing, of course, that those are transferable skills quite often, even if the Arabic is very different than English, even just that Arabic is read from right to left rather than, like it's a different structure, and, even underpinning the linguistic code is very different as well. But at least you have that, like it's a skill to learn, that you've learned to read, sound out letters, bring them together, that you can transfer typically. But for people who, number one, typically like Fatima, just can't get there because they're so exhausted from their caregiving and from their life experiences, how does that play out when she is afraid to leave to go visit her family now that things are a little bit, quote unquote, more calm? That she said it in that way, but I'm afraid to leave because what if they don't let me back in? I don't have Canadian citizenship. She doesn't trust it.
She's right.
Yeah. So how does that then translate to her, just again, her isolation, the feeling that I don't have my family here? And, maybe it would be a little bit eased if she could visit with them, but the money to do that, but also even if she could figure out the financial situation, what if they don't let us back in? And we've already sacrificed so much to be here. All of that.
So I put my hand up. I really liked your explanation of what a curriculum is, because it's essentially life, whether it's at school, whether it's at home or out in the park. That's your curriculum. That's what builds you, makes you who you are. So I really appreciated that interpretation. Now, when it comes to this citizenship, there are so many people who can never be citizens because the norms that they're expected to perform in, just is not suitable for them. They're not going to be able to do many things for which the system is designed. The system is designed for exclusion, not inclusion, unfortunately. So many people are automatically excluded because the systems are not built for them or designed for them. So my question to you is, what can we do as CCMW to start really looking at, you rightly pointed out about inclusion being okay, come on in and that's it, we'll leave it to you now. You can be integrated now. We've integrated special needs kids, and that's all we need to do, without really thinking about, the unique needs of each and every child, and how you cannot put them in a classroom and expect them to be integrated, or any child to be integrated. So so what else can we do? I mean, this discussion is great. Your presentation was excellent. I learned so much, but we'd love to work with you on how to do this so that we can, work with settlement organizations and make them aware of the needs of mothers
Mhm.
who are refugees who have children with disabilities. I'd love to be able to do this, what you just did for us, to OCASI, for instance, which is the Ontario
Mhm.
Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants.
Yeah, and so I think thank you so much for that, Nazhat, because I think this is a really important and often largely ignored issue because it's easy to ignore, and I'm just going to say it, that too often those without any kind of power in a society that doesn't, again, like Fatima said, she feels she's not even seen as human. So if it was white children who are able-bodied and families who are experiencing anything even remotely similar, there would be an uproar. And so I think it's just for these stories to be shared and for people to understand that, there are many different children and families that are struggling in ways that we can only ever imagine. But also, what I'm finding is that a lot of people aren't aware, and this is something that I wish would come to Alberta, and we're trying to make this happen because I'm now part of the advisory board for Smile Canada. And if you search Smile Canada, it is specifically for racialized children with disabilities. And it's a advocacy and community-based center. It is phenomenal because what they're doing is they're providing supports that are currently not even on the radar for government agencies. There's a huge, generally in these ableist systems, children with disabilities barely thought of and considered. But again, at the intersections of race, Islamophobia, just all of these different systems, the gap is huge and what is made available to people. So Smile Canada is a great organization. I encourage everybody to look into Smile Canada and potentially donate to it, but we need more. And we need more service providers who are finding these things, but also we need to hold our elected officials to account when they're not being provided. Because as much as I love Smile Canada, this should, like you said, this should not be happening. But yeah, it is so prevalent. And so I think that one of the things that we have to do is get better at uniting with different organizations and increasing the advocacy efforts and just a general awareness, because people knew that these are the types of things that were happening and that people were grappling and facing. I do think that there would be changes.
Nisette, sorry, you're muted.
I was just saying that Smile Canada is an ally of CCMW. We've mutually supported our organizations, and we'll do more, inshallah. Anyway, I will not hog this conversation because I know there are other people that will want to talk to you, but maybe this is just the beginning of the conversation, and inshallah we'll have opportunities to tell more of your stories. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Nisette and Nina, for your questions and comments. I don't see any other questions in the chat or Q&A. So maybe we can move on to Sabrine, and if anything else comes up, we can address it later on.
Sure, of course. Thank you, Muna, for your wonderful presentation. I also learned so much. I don't want to take up people's time, but I do want people to know about a fascinating project that CCMW is now undertaking. It is here to offer support to Muslim women facing any kind of gender-based violence. And often when we think of gender-based violence, so many things come to our mind. It means a plethora of things. It can be cyber, it can be physical, it can be sexual violence, it can be psychological violence, emotional, economic, and it continues. But discrimination or harassment can also be forms of gender-based violence. So with this project at CCMW, it's two-part. The first part is much more hands-on, more like a service provider where Muslim women anywhere in Canada can contact CCMW. You can contact us by email. We'll put the information in the link here. And we can connect you with the right resources and services to help you get through the gender-based violence that you are currently enduring. The second part is a systemic change strategy and tool. So it comes with a GBV review guide that we are developing with our colleague Silmi, who is working on that. And so that's going to help create changes on a systemic level to make gender-based violence support more accessible for Muslim women here in Canada. We also have an emergency bursary fund because we know that things don't happen in vacuum. So women facing GBV and are also facing financial insecurity and need financial assistance. They can also fill out an emergency bursary fund form. Again, I will put that information here in the chat box. And so if you want to learn anything about the Gender-Based Violence Project, please feel free to contact me. My name is Sabrine, and share the information with anyone you know, because I think each and every one of us know at least one person facing gender-based violence within our communities. And lastly, we do have a post-event survey link, and we'll be putting that in the chat box. And please fill that out because your feedback is important. And thank you, Iman, for posting that. And our goal is to refine each of these seminars. So thank you.
If there are no more questions, anyone, you can just unmute yourself and speak up, or comments. As Tarandeep said, she said, I don't have adequate words yet to express my thoughts to all of you. For now, thank you for holding the space and sharing such meaningful stories. Alhamdulillah, we're really fortunate to be able to do that. And so lucky to have Mona here with us. Well, Mona, I want to just thank you. I want to thank you for shining a light on the life of newcomer Muslim women who are also mothers of children with disabilities. We know that creating equitable spaces for all people and their intersectionalities must be of the utmost importance. We know that if we want to get a sense of society's well-being, it's not about the amount of wealth that our society is generating. It has to do with the way newcomers, seniors, Indigenous peoples, people with different abilities, and the needy are faring at the moment. Thank you for reminding us of what should matter to all Canadians. It's not fair to bring refugees to Canada and then forget about them or force them to fit into shapes and sizes that don't work for them. They are human beings and they deserve our support and respect. And the stories you shared will hopefully help us to live alongside each other and make this a more inclusive world for all. We pray that God bless you, Mona, and reward you for your years of scholarship and leadership. May Allah give you strength and patience to be able to continue to share the stories of all citizens. Finally, many thanks to our team at CCMW. Nusat, Zainab, Iman, and Umayma have been very supportive and helped bring this seminar together. And thanks to all of you who tuned in today. Your support and friendship are much appreciated. We're so happy to see old friends and meet new friends here today. Please remember to keep in touch with CCMW and follow our website and social media posts for upcoming events and projects. Until then, take care and assalamu alaikum. Thanks, Mona.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mona. That was incredible. I'm so glad that you joined us. And inshallah, like I said, we want you to come back and tell more stories so we can share more.
Inshallah. Thank you for having me. This meant a lot. Alhamdulillah. And it was a wonderful space. So thank you so much again. Jazakumullah khair for all your work and advocacy and all the things that you do too.
Thank you very much.